Hypnosis, a neglected research field. This is a presentation for the Society for Psychical Research in London on the 7th of June 2018. Now, I'm recording this for the benefit of those people with an interest in the subject who were unable to attend the lecture on the day. So I'm going to take you through the PowerPoint presentation and give an idea of what the lecture was all about. The history of telepathic hypnosis really can be traced back to the 18th century when Father Johann Joseph Gassner, German Catholic priest, was proclaimed, regarded the most powerful healer and exorcist in all of Christendom. He healed people in their thousands, and with the emergence of the scientific enlightenment, questions were asked about how this was possible. Science needed explanations, so they asked questions about the nature of Father Gassner's healings. Was this the power of genuine religious exorcism and the power of prayer? Was it a case of mass hypnosis, mass hysteria, perhaps? Was this the power of suggestion to a gullible public? Similarly, was this the power of expectation by a gullible public? And in scientific terms, modern scientific terms, was this the power of placebo? Now, Father Gassner was so successful, he drew attention to himself across a wide spectrum of society, and he was asked by various members of European royal family to give them healing. And he was summoned by the Pope, and the Pope ordered him to take a low profile and go away back to his parish and work quietly, not draw attention to himself. So, with the emergence of the scientific enlightenment, what were the explanations for his success? Now, along comes FRANZ MESMER, who openly challenged Father Gassner's success and said, I can do the same. I'm going to prove it. And he did. He challenged with his own method that he deemed to be scientific, and he called it animal magnetism. Now, and this gave rise to an enormous amount of activity in the healing arts across Europe, where many people learned Mesmer's techniques and applied them. And one of the disciples of Mesmer, the Marquis de Puysegur, a French aristocrat, began to notice an odd thing. Whenever he was thinking about a client that was coming to see him, very often that client would turn up at the door already in an altered state of consciousness, already in a trance. And the Marquis pondered on this, and he wrote, this is the kind of thing that's impossible to prove by rational arguments, and for which experience alone can provide certainty. And I mention this because it brings up the debate, the argument between rational thought and the application of experience to unusual phenomena. And this was something that was taken up by William James later on, 100 years later, in his Pragmatism, where he said you cannot discount experience from scientific inquiry. So this is, from my research, the first example of documentation on this topic. Frederick Myers, one of the founding fathers of the Society for Psychical Research in 1882, spent 20 years examining evidence and researching primarily to see if there was any scientific evidence to support the theory that the human personality survives bodily death. And during the course of his investigation, he became interested in telepathic hypnosis and said this: the evidence for telepathy, for psychical influence from a distance, has grown to goodly proportions. For a new form of experiment has been found possible, from which the influence of suggestion can be entirely excluded. As Myers argued that in the hypnotic trance, in the altered state of consciousness, the power of suggestion was not the only answer, and he set out to prove that. It has now, as I shall presently try to show, been actually proved that a hypnotic trance can be induced from a distance so great and with precautions so complete that telepathy or some similar supernormal influence is the only efficient cause which can be conceived. So if you want to discount the power of suggestion, what better way to do it than to influence a hypnotic trance from a distance beyond the conscious awareness and therefore beyond the defenses of a person at a distance. Now, Myers was involved with the experiments conducted by Pierre Janet, who conducted experiments with his subject Leonie in Le Havre, and he published his findings in two French scientific journals. So these are where the experiments in telepathic hypnosis originated. We move on now to Myers' assertion that's linked with his other investigations into the survival of the personality after death. And he says, in my view, each man is essentially a spirit controlling an organism which is itself a complex of lower and smaller lives. As you get into the profounder part of man's being, you get nearer to the source of his human vitality. And now this is a very, very deep, profound statement, because it turns on its head the ideas we have about the physical ideas we have about human existence. What this says is that man is a spirit that possesses a material form, and that using the altered state of consciousness, as you get deeper into the profounder part of man's being, into his spirit that is, you get nearer to the source of his human vitality. This observation turns modern psychiatry and psychology on its head. Now, before the advent of medical anesthesia, chemical anesthetics, mesmerism was applied in medicine by many surgeons, many doctors, physicians. One of them, Dr. John Elliotson in London, wrote his book, Numerous Cases of Surgical Operation Without Pain in a Mesmeric State. Another surgeon, Dr. James Esdale, with the Indian Army in Calcutta, wrote about his techniques and his experiences, Mesmerism in India, its practical application in surgery and medicine. James Esdale performed more than 300 major surgical operations using mesmerism for pain-free surgery. And interestingly, Esdale argued and wrote against the overriding theory that the hypnotic trance was induced by the power of suggestion. by James Braid. James Braid actually coined the term hypnosis. So there was a shift from mesmerism to hypnosis at that time, induced by James Braid. But Elliotson argued against this because he explained how he would induce an altered state of consciousness into his patients prior to surgery simply by focusing his attention on them whilst they were in another room being visited by relatives. So he could prepare them for the surgery telepathically using telepathic hypnosis. And this is well documented in his book, Mesmerism in India. Of course, chemical anesthetics came along, and the use of mesmerism and hypnosis for surgery went out of fashion. Now, much later, we move now to the 20th century with Leonid Vasilyev, a Russian neurologist at the University of Leningrad, was inspired by reading the work of Myers and Janet on telepathic hypnosis, and the neurologist needed to understand how this worked. So he conducted a series of experiments where he tested the effect of suggestion over a great distance between Leningrad and Vladivostok. And this initiated many more experiments with other societies around the world, with the American Society for Psychical Research, with the Greek Society in Athens. And they experimented with suggestion over great distances. Athens to Paris, 2,101 kilometers. Warsaw to Athens, 1,597 kilometers. Vienna to Athens, 1,284 kilometers. Leningrad to Sevastopol, 1,700. New York to Paris, 5,843. And London to Australia, 16,983 kilometers. Now, what's interesting about Vasilyev's research was that he and all these other experimenters from these other societies were trying to prove that the thought is carried, the suggestion is carried on an electromagnetic wave. And you can measure the electromagnetic activity in the brain. And this gave them the idea that the thought is carried by electromagnetism. But they could never prove it. And eventually the funding was removed, was taken away. They lost interest, and the experiments were abandoned. However, Vasilyev notes natural obstacles such as the curvature of the Earth's surface, hills, etc., do not affect the phenomenon. He goes on to say, like the usual radio waves, it operates at long distances, but as opposed to radio waves, it is not impeded by metal screening. So what does that tell us? Although Vasilyev doesn't explicitly say this, what it tells us is that time and distance are irrelevant. It tells us that the thought is not carried from A to B. It tells us that the thought is spontaneous, instantaneous, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world, or the distance, or the time taken. The thought is received by the recipient instantaneously. Difficulty with this is that the physical sciences that are predominant in the modern world were just unable to accept this idea or to acknowledge the empirical data. Now, the scientific framework for this extends beyond the physical. Physics cannot accommodate this, although quantum physics, with the breakdown of Newtonian laws, are perhaps leading in the right direction. That is suggested. But for an understanding of the scientific framework to accommodate these phenomena, it's worth a read The Science of Spirit Possession, which is my book, which was based largely on Meyer's research. It gives a full explanation of the scientific framework. And here you see two covers. The one on the right is a recent cover from the publishers because a paperback version was published, which is smaller, thinner, and less expensive. But essentially, the book is the same. So serious researchers into these phenomena would get benefit from reading this book. So research into telepathic hypnosis, where are we now? What's happened since Vasilyev's experiments? Well, they've actually led to remote viewing because the Russians used the principles for spying on the US, and when the US got to hear about it, the CIA embarked upon their own program of remote viewing. So we are all familiar with the principles of remote viewing, but why is telepathic hypnosis not being used in medicine? Now, I've been fortunate recently in being presented with cases where families have agreed to experiment with telepathic hypnosis, and I'm going to present three case studies. The first one is of a 23-year-old male who'd been sectioned for hearing voices and psychotic behaviour that caused a great deal of distress for his family. And the family agreed that he would be, we would try telepathic hypnosis with him. Second case study is another 23-year-old when he was sectioned under the Mental Health Act and held in a psychiatric hospital in the UK. And his family asked for help outside the NHS. He'd been diagnosed with autism at the age of 16 and with psychosis at the age of 18. He'd been talking about being in the dark side and saying that he had a third eye. And his psychiatrist saw this as evidence of psychosis. But his mother said that she always had a strong feeling that her son's problems were more than being autistic or psychotic. And again, she agreed to allow her son to be accessed telepathically. Case study number 3, adopted at the age of 12 months by an educated and well-provisioned professional couple, David shared his adoptive family with an adopted sister. At the age of 17, as his behaviour became increasingly challenging and without adequate resolution from the NHS mental health care system, the family asked for help from non-traditional sources and agreed to an experiment with telepathic hypnosis. And I shall be presenting these case studies. And just to finish this part of the lecture, I'd like to go back to Myers, who said, and I quote, "Deeper still lies the stage of highest interest, that sleep-waking state in which the subliminal self is at last set free, is at last not only able to receive but to respond. When it begins to tell the secrets of the sleeping phase of personality, beginning with directions as to the conduct of the trance or of the cure, and going on to who knows what insights into who knows what worlds afar." Food for thought, and thank you for listening.